Confucius once wrote, "Study the past if you would define the future." And that's exactly what we're doing on this special program, Journey Through Civilizations. My special guests are Alan Macfarlane, the historian and Emeritus Professor at King's College, Cambridge, Dr Qian Gao, the Assistant Professor of Archaeology at the University of Durham, and John Hobson at Sheffield University, Professor of International Relations. They're all here to consider how looking back into antiquity can shed light on opportunities for improved cultural understanding in our modern world, and specifically how understanding China's roots can improve international relations today. What do you mean by civilization? What do we mean when we say civilization? John, how about you kick us off?
I used to talk about the dialogue of civilizations until I went to a conference and somebody asked me a question and basically said, look, this dialogue that you talk about in the way that you do, it's not really a dialogue, it's kind of a monologue. And the way you use civilization seems to offend the principle of civilization. So kind of after that, I dropped the term. So, I mean, the civilization, we think of civilization as kind of bigger version of, you know, a conglomerate of national entities, a regional entity. The problem I have with the concept is that once you use that concept, it sounds like that particular civilization is somehow kind of self-constituting, it's self-made, it's autonomous. And once you've got that notion in play, you've got a billiard ball, right? So then you can talk about civilizations clashing, which Samuel Huntington has done to sad effect, and it has very much kind of influenced the way we think about world politics. So I see it as a rather problematic concept, and in the wrong hand, a dangerous concept.
Okay, Qian Gao, what should we make of civilization?
Yeah, I think the word itself is actually a very complex concept from the archaeology or from, let's say, a historical or anthropological perspective. I don't think there's a set, a set of definition or a set of hallmarks or traits that can be used at a universal scale to define once, let's say, a set of a culture or a group of settlement, once they develop to a certain stage, that reaches the threshold of civilization. I think in reality, the understanding of civilization should be more holistic than analytical. And also, I find the word civilization, when you put it into a Chinese context, 文明, it has multiple meanings embedded, which might go beyond the English word civilization itself. And that's why when we understand what counts as civilization, I think different contexts and different historical scenario will have different meaning and different set of criteria.
Alan, what about you?
I find it very easy. I teach this to my students. You have, before civilizations, you have tribal societies, and then you have civilized societies. And the difference, there are about 6 characteristics. One is there's writing and literacy, some form of written communication. Secondly, there are advanced crafts like porcelain and weaving and so on. Thirdly, there's some kind of strong governmental organization with a governing class and the people who are ruled. Next, there are dense settlements, usually small towns or even cities. Then there's a taxation system. So there's a set of ingredients which go together to make the difference between oral, small-scale tribal groups and the next level up. And you don't necessarily have to have all these ingredients, but if you have a number of them, then we start talking about civilization.
Well, that's the broad brush stuff. Let's start drilling this down. Qian Gao, what's the earliest we know about Chinese history from archaeological digs?
Archaeological, let's say, research has unearthed a wealth of, let's say, tangible evidence that collectively paint, let's say, a vivid picture of Chinese culture, Chinese history that dating back to several millennia. But it's very difficult to say which is the earliest sort of a record, because how do you define history? And how do you define human history? Are we talking about sort of the current human activities. So, for example, if we talk about the written annals of Chinese history, normally from a traditional point of view, we start with the Xia dynasty. However, this dynasty, the discussion about this dynasty has concerned that it's a kind of a dynasty of mystery. At the same time, archaeological excavation, especially at sites, for example, the Erlitou site in recent years, it has supporting, or it has implying the existence of a complex society which align with the traditional accounts of the Xia.
When do we see the first links, perhaps, between East and West?
Well, it depends on whether you're going to describe sporadic linkages or whether you're going to talk about, regular, important linkages. So, if you're talking about sporadic linkages, you can go back to 3,500 BC, ancient Sumer, which a lot of people do. Moving forward in time, you can talk about the Roman Empire trading in silk from China. Moving forward in time again, you can talk about, Marco Polo and the various friars that went over to China, sojourned there in the 13th century. Important though all that is, these are not sustained connections. So what we need are regular connections, wide connections in the sense that it's not just a relationship between the West and one, like the Middle East, for example, but the whole of the non-West, and impactful relations, i.e. these relations shape Western civilization and perhaps vice versa. Although in fact, for most of the time before 1800, it was the East shaping the West and not the other way around. So, to cut a long story short, although Europe had strong relations, not very good relations, with the Islamic Middle East after about 750, 800, it was really, I would say, after 1500. Now, of course, when I say 1500, everyone thinks of the Age of Discovery and Europe going out, and actually that's not what I have in mind. I talk about the first global economy emerging around that time, and the key players, China, India, Middle East, Africa. Europeans played a role, not an insignificant role, but it's a kind of brokerage role. It was these non-Western powers that were crucial. That's when you can really start to see these East-West connections going on strong. But, when we think of globalization, we think of something after 1945. No, this was going on a lot earlier.
Let's talk about the hard archaeological evidence, Qian Gao. One of the most recent discoveries has been the work at Shanxing Dui. But you always get the sense with this conversation that archaeologists are scratching at the surface, and we have just so much more to discover. And that is the case on this, isn't it?
Exactly. The topic Shanxing Dui is a subject close to my heart because it's very close to my hometown. And it is one of the ancient cultures that challenge the traditional, interpretation of Chinese ancient civilization, because the artifacts found at this site, they do not resemble that of those other known sites of the same period. And recent excavation, we know in the last few years, the new pits were discovered, and there were thousands of amazing, intricately made artifacts being discovered. And however, because of the vast size of the vast scale of the site, and also the depths of its cultural layers, is still the more we dig, the more questions we have. And for example, we still don't know the origin of this culture. And another thing is, what's its relationship between this particular culture and its sort of a neighboring culture, and why it's suddenly this apparently sudden abandonment of this site.
And Alan, do you think this is an obsession of splendid, pointy-headed academics like all of you three, or does this have real traction amongst people in China today? Are they genuinely engaged in this narrative about China's past? How important do you think the past is to people in China today?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. There's a schizophrenia in China about the past. On the one hand, it's a civilization which treasures the past hugely. It's a strange thing when you go to China. People suddenly quote a bit of poetry or some bit of philosophy, and you say, well, when's that from? And they say, well, that's Tang, or that's Mencius, or something like this. And it's today. The past 2,000 years ago is still living alive today. On the other hand, they're told, and their education until recently was that China began in 1949. Everything before that was the olds, which have to be eradicated, or even perhaps 1912 with the fall of the empire. So they're told in their formal teaching that China is very new and modern and everything is changing around them, and yet their hearts and minds tell them that China is very old and ancient. And the last thing to say is that the balance is shifting, because in the last 20 years going to China, I've noticed that the interest in the Chinese past, and she is talking about this, the recreation of the ancient culture of China has become very important for the Chinese. So the balance towards interest in the past has grown again.
Let's flip the question then, John, if we can. I mean, do you think those in the West perhaps feel the same about their shared past?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I agree with everything that Professor Macfarlane has said. Yeah, you do get this kind of schizophrenic thing where, I mean, I went to China a couple of times, gave various talks about frankly, the magnificence of China's past. And I got two reactions. One reaction was, I don't believe you. And the other reaction was, this is great. We need to hear more about this. And I thought to myself, well, I said actually, well, why do you need a white Westerner to come over here and tell you about your amazing past? It didn't make sense to me. So I think Professor Macfarlane's right about 1949. You know, this is the great transformational break. In part, that's because of the 100 years of humiliation. So put an end to the 100 years of humiliation, new beginning. That all sounds, you know, completely understandable. Yet there is a sense in which Maoism, of course, wanted to break with the kind of so-called backward past that Marxism had depicted China as. You know, Marx actually described China as a semi-civilized or barbarian country vegetating in the teeth of time, which he borrowed from Friedrich Hegel. It was pretty disparaging stuff. And it's kind of the legacy is carried on, as it were, which is a great irony, because China's past is probably the most interesting of any country in the world. It has done huge amounts of pioneering activities in all manner of ways, some of which I'll talk about later. And yet all that was kind of swept under the carpet. But I do agree with Professor Macfarlane that I think the Shanghe's treasure ships, there's a model of the treasure ship, quite a large one that's been put on display. I'm not sure where it is, maybe in Beijing, which is great. I mean, this was a phenomenal achievement, the treasure ship. I won't go into that now. But it's good to see China realizing about its past, because it's something to be proud of.
You wrote the book, The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization. I mean, do you think, it's a wide question, I know, but do you think that we in the West understand perhaps where our roots really are?
No. No, I don't, which is why I wrote that book. And look, I mean, academics love to talk about their own work, don't they? So
yeah, it's the only plug in this, don't worry.
ISBN to follow. But I'll just to give you a flavour of this, since I'm talking about Chinese civilization, is that, you know, the story of our past is that, you know, we consider that the West is the dominant civilization today. We go back in time to 1500, the Age of Discovery, and we say, look, you know, it all began then, and it was just an ineluctable teleological path where we would break through to modernity and so on and so forth. In none of this is there any recognition or acceptance or acknowledgement of the debt that the West owes to China. The West owes a big debt to China. So many of the technologies that enabled the rise of the West, that the West turns around and says were invented by the West, actually came from China. The rotary winning machine and the iron moldball plough, these came from China. They were actually brought over. And in the case of the iron moldball plough, it was converted into what we knew as the Rotherham plough, which came about in the early 1730s, refined by James Small. That was the centrepiece of the British agricultural revolution. Without that plough, there would not have been that agricultural revolution. Without that agricultural revolution in Britain, the prospects for British industrialisation would have been stymied. And yet, what do we hear? What do we see when we look at British economic history textbooks? James Small refined this plough, as if he came up with it from scratch, but he didn't. And I could go on about a whole load of other technologies. Just to give you a snippet, 1784, Henry Cort comes up with the puddling process right? A major development in iron production. Converts cast iron into wrought iron, and it produced huge amounts. That process was invented nearly 2,000 years earlier in China. It's the exact same process.
We'll pause there for a moment, but do stay with us as we continue our journey through civilizations after the break.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Welcome back to a special program here on CGTN, Journey Through Civilizations, as we look at how understanding the past can inform the future. Let's return now to my discussion with Alan Macfarlane, historian and Emeritus Professor at King's College, Cambridge, Dr Qian Gao, Assistant Professor of Archaeology at the University of Durham, and John Hobson, Professor of International Relations at Sheffield University.
Let me bring Qian Gao in for a moment, because one of your specialities is the, if I can call it, the social value of historic sites. Do you think those values are consistent across the world?
I would say yes and no. So when the archaeological site be considered as a heritage site, when they have social value, they are no longer just let's say the material aspect of it. It's no longer just the relics from the past. It starts to have other sort of meanings attached to them. And for example, those social values, they start to serve, let's say, a vocal point or touchstones of different communities, let's say identity, sense of belonging, their memory. So a lot of other significance and meaning associated with it. So even though, let's say, that the idea of valuing certain heritage sites, archaeological sites, it is a universal practice, but the specific cultural values are very different in specific sort of scenarios. And for different community groups, for example, we value an archaeological site, let's say the Liangzhu site, as a Chinese, we feel a sense of national pride. We feel a sense of, let's say, it's important roots from our past. But maybe for the local community, the meaning can be different.
Alan, let me bring you in and ask you how much you think the past perhaps informs the way we look at relations between China and the rest of the world now. Does it matter? Does it come into play?
Hugely, yes. I mean, I think John Maynard Keynes said that the common sense and down-to-earth economist doesn't realize that he is trapped in the thoughts of ancient dead philosophers or some such way. We, our children, particularly our parliament and our politicians, have no idea that their prejudices and their ignorance and their attitudes are influenced by 200 years of what was referred to the century of humiliation and so on. Most people, and this includes many of my friends and my family and so on, look at China basically as if it was the 19th century. These are backward, uncivilized, brutal, untrustworthy people who don't believe in Jesus and God and so on. And they are inferior to us. I mean, there's a sad parallel with what's happening in Israel and Palestine. The attitude of the West towards China traditionally has been similar to what is happening there. So basically, we are shaped by this, and I was too. I mean, I knew nothing about China until quite recently when I went there. And I was, insofar as I was educated about it, it was 19th and early 20th century stereotypes. And this continued to finish off because of the representations of the Maoist period. If they weren't like that, they were sort of all wearing blue and they were all chanting and running around with a little red book. So stereotypes are out of date and they take about 100 years to catch up with reality. But now it's all changing, I hope.
It's all changing. Qian Gao, and we should ask the diplomatic community these questions, I think, perhaps, rather than you. I mean, let me ask you whether or not you think that relations in the present international relations, can really ever succeed without being based in the past.
I don't think it would. Well, it is feasible to establish relationship in, let's say, in trade or in diplomatic activity without constantly referring to the past. However, without understanding of the past, without the nuanced understanding of the past, those relationships can be very foundationless.
John, quick thought on that. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, completely agree with that. It's not just a case of bringing in the past, because the way the West has understood the past has created the problems in part that we suffer in the present. So to put that in plain English, we need to rethink China in particular in this context and understand it better. For example, let me just give you one example, the Belt and Road Initiative. We've got Western hawks claiming that the Belt and Road Initiative is another imperialist project, just like the old Chinese tribute system. Westerners in the 19th century called it the tribute system. It wasn't the tribute system. It neither collected tribute nor was it a system, but never mind. And they described it as imperialist, and they see the Belt and Road Initiative as a continuation of the tribute system. I agree. The Belt and Road Initiative is a continuation of the tribute system. But not because of what they say, but because I don't think the tribute system was imperialist. I could go on, but I don't think it was. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is similar. It's trying, the tribute system actually created harmonious relations, peace. You had 500 years of virtual peace at a time when Europe was ripping itself apart in wars. You had all sorts of things going on in harmonious ways. I see the Belt and Road Initiative as a continuation of that, but the West wants to demonize it, just like it demonized Chinese past. And if we carry on like this, we've got problems. The world has got problems.
Alan, why do you think those in the West, present company here accepted, of course, pay seemingly so little attention to Chinese civilization? I mean, is it inevitable? I'm much older than you, but our generation, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, lived through the horror of the First World War and the Second World War. Our history teaching on our lives in these islands and on this continent were inevitably and have been inevitably shaped over the last 100 years by those events. Do you have some sympathy with our failure to engage in interest in Chinese civilization because of our preoccupation with what has gone on here over the last 100 years?
Well, I both have sympathy and understanding. I went through a very good historical education at Oxford and so on, and China was never mentioned. Even when I taught anthropology at Cambridge for 20, 30 years, China was never mentioned. And so if you probably don't realize how ignorant the British are about China. 99% of the British know absolutely nothing, including those who are making the big decisions. If you asked the top politicians who are anti-China now 5 or 6 questions about China, tell me the name of one Chinese emperor. What was the Taiping rebellion? Any basic questions, they wouldn't know. They probably don't know where China is. I mean, if you ask them to fill it in on a map, they would, but they hate it. They know where they hate it, and the less they know, the more they hate it.
We seem to be at a pivotal moment, as we always seem to be, of course. Where do you see relations going between China and the West?
I'm not terribly sanguine right now, but then that's the kind of rationale for this kind of project that's going ahead. I'm not sanguine because the willful neglect or the willful misunderstanding of China, which has created this kind of clash of civilizations discourse. You know, we've now got virtually two sides staring each other down. And I'm always reminded of the Elvis Presley song, my favourite Elvis Presley song, Caught in a Trap. We can't go on together with suspicious minds. And that's kind of what we got. It just needs a change in attitude to get past that. But if we can, more Elvis Presley, less Eurocentrism, maybe we can navigate through these unnecessarily choppy waters that we find ourselves in today.
My university, Cambridge, is famous for its boat race against Oxford and for rowing competitions. And having watched rowing competitions and the boat race, there's a very dangerous moment when Oxford or Cambridge is overtaking the other because the oars can hit each other and the boats. We're in that position at the moment. China and East Asia is overtaking the West and America, and it's a very dangerous moment. Once the boat is ahead, then things can calm down. So I think if we can get through the next 5 or 10 years without blowing each other up, then there's a chance that things will get better.
I just want to, we're in the last minutes of our discussion, but I want to ask you a question as we're in this extraordinary building with so many 100 years of history. I mean, the story of Britain is almost contained within these walls. How do you preserve places like this? It goes to the heart of China's development and Western development. I mean, it's of particular interest to you. I mean, how do you define that line between preservation and development? Because it's a raging argument in both China and certainly the UK, particularly in the city. Qian Gao.
Well, you asked one of the most challenging questions for the heritage management scenario these days. Try to find a fine line between the preserving the values and allowing some changes to happen at the same time. That's the best answer I can give at the moment. I know it sounds very vague, but it is a very tricky decision-making a lot of those decision-makers have to encounter these days.
We talk a lot in these debates about the responsibility of governments. We blame governments for everything, don't we? Sometimes correctly. I just want your thoughts on the role of ordinary citizens when it comes to our cultural heritage, on our cultural protection. Qian Gao, your thoughts on that?
More participation and more engagement is always better, because when something becomes heritage, it means it's for people. So the focus of, let's say, preserving the past, I think sometimes the focus should move from focusing on the things to focus on the relationship between things and the current people. And that'll be my answer.
John?
I was very encouraged once in China when, some years ago, when I was talking to someone about the terrible times the Chinese have lived through and the future, and they said, well, China will change because our children are changing. They are living in a different world and they understand things beyond China, and their generation will be much more tolerant. They don't see within the stereotypes that we inherited. And so I think ordinary people, and ordinary people being educated in schools now, because now there are so many, for example, Chinese in Britain, in British schools and universities and so on. And it's very difficult to want to bomb people into the Stone Age if you've been to school with them and you know something about their culture. So that ordinary people experiencing intercultural experiences, it's not quite answering your question, but I think I have hopes in the younger generation. My grandchildren learn Chinese and so on. And they'll say, well, why are you making all this fuss about difference and inferiority? They're friends of ours.
It's a lovely thing to end on. So would you give a round of applause for him? Thank you.